Well, I've got that case cleaned up. I've repainted it. This camera will only just focus. It's not the world's best paint job. There's a bit of a sag in it here, which I may have to buff off if it causes me any problems. But the area that was devoid of paint was at this side here, and now it's nice and black and shiny. So the case is clean. And did I discover anything else while I was in there? Well, yes. The little flash contact visible here, that had come out. I assumed that had snapped off, but it hadn't snapped off. It was actually tucked down inside the plastic, and presumably at one stage it was spot welded to the rest of the other piece of the contact here, and the spot weld had obviously given way. But given that it's two pieces of a copper alloy in close physical contact, I don't see that there's any likelihood that that's going to cause a problem with connection. So I expect that that will be fine just as it is, and I'll carry on with my repair. So now I've got to clean my diaphragm blades and the retainer plate and the rotating ring that swings the blades in and out, and reassemble that section. Well, here's our retainer plate and our 5 diaphragm blades. The moving ring that activates those swings them in and out, and 3, this pair of tweezers is covered in some terrible stuff, I have to clean that. 3 screws that hold this together. See if I can get these tweezers a bit cleaned up. Just put a bit of naphtha on a cotton bud. It's probably some glue residue or something I've picked up on those tweezers. Makes them sticky. It's hard to put things down rather than hard to pick things up. Right, so the retainer plate here has got graphite powder loose on it. There's no doubt in my mind someone had puffed some of that in there. The 2 faces of the retainer plate. This is the face that goes towards the shutter blades, and it has 5 small indentations in it. This is the face that goes towards the diaphragm blades. It's entirely plain except for this one locating post on the outside edge. I'm going to clean this with some naphtha, see how it cleans up. This surface I'm interested in, it's got some corrosion there, some light corrosion. If that feels smooth, that won't cause a problem. This is some copper alloy, it's not steel. If it feels rough, I might polish that with a bit of Brasso. The moving ring here is pretty filthy. It's quite oily, greasy looking around the edges. I think this is graphite powder on the surface here, not corrosion, so I expect that to clean up. And looking at these blades, I'm looking to see if there's any obvious corrosion on them, any serious corrosion. Normally I do not polish the diaphragm blades with Brasso, and that's because it's very easy to catch a cleaning rag or a cotton bud on one of these posts, these rivets, and if you do so, you may easily bend the blade. And they're fairly high tensile steel. If you bend them, they'll take a good set, and it's very hard to straighten them out afterwards. So I'll start cleaning some of these pieces up. Okay, let's start with these blades, I suppose. So with some naphtha on a cotton bud, Q-tip. I'll swab these blades carefully. To remove any traces of oil or grease, and that loose graphite powder too, which probably is not required here. Now looking closely at this blade, I can see, because I'm I can see the light from the window to my right. Looking across that blade, I can see that there's a slight rough patch just there. I don't think that's serious. If that's the only blade that looks like that, that won't be a problem. On these shutters, the aperture settings and the shutter speed settings are held together by a spring clip, so that you set the combination, the EV value, and then you can move your shutter speed setting and the aperture setting automatically moves with it. If the diaphragm blades are sticky, either because they're covered in oil or because they are damaged in some other way, then what may happen is that you set your EV value, you decide that you would perhaps like to use a 2/50th of a second instead of 125th of a second because you want to get a clearer image of a moving action, for example. You may find that the aperture doesn't automatically shift from f11 to f8 as you expected. If these blades are sticky, it may stay exactly where it was, in which case you will end up underexposed. Now that blade was certainly dirtier than the other ones. Stripping the diaphragm like this and cleaning the blades individually was something that was done normally as part of a shutter CLA, clean, lube and adjust. But reassembling diaphragms can be sometimes tricky, which means that when people are pressed for time, they sometimes didn't do it. Particularly if there didn't appear to be any obvious problem, they would simply skip that bit, or perhaps wipe the blades in place and carry on with the rest of the shutter. Let's have a look at this. You can see there's a lot of dirt coming off here, or a lot of something. Grease, graphite powder, mixture of both, or just dirt. Right, that's one face. Now normally I'd be doing this on a white paper serviette, because they're nice and cheap and they're nice and durable. But unfortunately, when I'm filming something like this, it causes the camera to perceive that as being very bright. It closes down and all these nice dark components then become black, and so you can't see what I'm doing. So I've got this on a grey paper serviette, which unfortunately, although it's a pretty colour, possibly somewhat darker than Kodak 18% grey, it is also soft, tears easily, and as a result not much fun to work on. Well, that's that piece. This piece, this is the cover, the retainer plate. This was the most marked piece and the most heavily marked piece, and I've got no idea how well this will clean at the moment. If there's any roughness to the surface here, of course that would make it more difficult, would make the blades less likely to run smoothly and easily, and you want to avoid that. So I'm looking at this surface. This surface faces towards the diaphragm blades. You can probably see here, I'll get this in the right light. Here, that's fingerprints, and those fingerprints have etched in because someone has picked that up between finger and thumb, and their perspiration has created corrosion, and there's fingerprints all around here and quite heavily here. That's quite common. There's another patch of corrosion right here. That's I'll give that a little scrape, see what that looks like. I scrape that with a toothpick. That's where that piece bears against the case, and that's probably where that case was showing the most corrosion. Just rubbing a toothpick over this, I can feel if there's any serious lumps and bumps or roughness, and there is over at this side. At this side, just rubbing it with a toothpick just took all those lumps and bumps off, but this is a little bit rougher. I'm going to clean this with some Brasso and then come back. Okay, I've just cleaned that off with some Brasso. I'm going to clean it now with naphtha again and see what sort of a state it's in, see if things appear improved, and of course remove any residue from the metal polish. Oh, that looks much better. That looks very good. And that rough area was all over here, and just rubbing the cotton bud across there, you can get a feel for how clean that is, how well your cleaning process worked. I'm just cleaning it once more to make sure I've got rid of all of the residue from the metal polish. These parts are brass or some similar alloy, and they've been chemically blackened. So what we're seeing, these marks that you see on it here, are where the chemical blackening has gone from corrosion and from me polishing it away. Well, that's good. That part looks fine now, and I can reassemble the diaphragm. I'll get it on this jig. If the camera decides it would like to focus there for me, that's a bit better. So this plate goes on the jig and the rivet is up. The rivet here is pointing upwards. Now you can start anywhere you like with the blades pretty much. These are assembled anti-clockwise, just one over the top of the previous one. I can see these blades have a bit of a bend to them, they're not lying dead flat. That means at some stage this shutter, the diaphragm blades have been sticky with oil, and that means that when you apply a lot of force to the setting lever to move them, they tend to bow up. They buckle up instead of moving freely, and that leaves them with a set. Means that they don't lie dead flat afterwards. Now when you get round to the last couple of blades, you have to pull the first blades back out of the way so you can get the last blade positioned. I just knocked the jig then, so I may have unseated one of the blades. In fact, the last one looks like it has come loose. That's better. So all the blades in position, I've got to lift the first blades back over the last blades so that everything lies down smoothly, like that. Now, got my control ring here, or the ring that opens and closes the blades, and at this point on my jig, I'll turn this round so you can see, here is the locating post at this point. This piece goes on here. I've just got to get it seated over the top of all of those 5 blades. It should just wriggle in. That's better, that's correct. Now the case gets lowered in place. Now that post, that rivet there, hops into a little hole in the case right here. It's pretty hard to mistake that. If I get that lined up correctly, like that, give that a bit of a wriggle, that should drop into position, and then holding the whole lot together, I'll swing my jig over, remove the outer part of my jig, and I'm just looking to make sure that all the rivets are correct, still the posts are still correctly placed in that retainer, and everything looks like it's correctly positioned, and I can fit the 3 retaining screws. Just do the screws up quite lightly. If for some reason one of the blades was displaced while you were lifting the cover into position, you would end up with its post or its little pivot out of position, and if you tighten the plate up you may damage the blade. So do the screws up lightly. They're done. check the action, make sure that the blades move smoothly, and they do. That's good, that part's done. I can tighten the 3 screws. The screws are only small, they're only going into aluminium. The aluminium's fairly soft. You'll strip them out if you go crazy doing them up. Now, how hard you do them up, the feel for it is something that you really only develop with experience. It's a difficult thing to teach. But you do get it. It's like having a torque wrench in your fingers, I suppose. Right, well there's our shutter case. That's ready to go, and that can go aside now, and I need to turn my attention to the mechanism plate. I'll start cleaning up this mechanism plate. I'm just using some naphtha, and on this side you can see the shadow of the shutter blades outlined in what looks to be graphite powder. Just leaves a silvery imprint where it's been rubbed into the surface. And the mechanism plate is anodised aluminium. It's very anodised aluminium is very resistant to wear. It's much harder than untreated aluminium, which is quite a soft metal. Some alloys are much harder than others, of course, but the surface treatment really makes the difference. This has probably been lubricated with graphite grease. That's quite commonly done. Used judiciously, there's no problem with graphite grease in the right place. But these are not truck gearboxes. They don't need great wadges of grease all over the place. I typically use molybdenum paste to lubricate the spots where there's a good deal of friction. And that, that mechanism plate's clean now, that's good. This is the blade actuating ring, the piece that is shifted backwards and forwards and swings the blades in and out as it does. You can see that there's a fair bit of grease on here, graphite grease I would expect. And the problems with grease typically is that the solvent components boil out over time and you're left with the base, which means they go from being something thin and runny to something thick and gooey. That looks good. Now, looking at an earlier photo of this in the shutter, it appeared that this arm was bent up slightly on the side. I'll check that once it's assembled. It may have been just an optical illusion. It should lie fairly flat inside the shutter. But if the blades had been very, very stiff, and if somebody had forced that lever, then that may have caused that arm on the blade actuating ring to to bend up slightly. Again, like the blades, this is high tensile steel, I think, and if you bend it, if you manage to put a bend in it, you are not going to get a sharp crease out of it. It's just not going to happen. So I'm just cleaning around the blade. This is the lens tube. The front lens sits into the front part here. It's called the lens tube. And the blade actuating ring runs around the back end of this here, around the centre. And so I'm just removing old grease and stuff from that point. The centre of this is a bit stained and marked. That makes absolutely no difference. The lens itself comes right back into here. None of that will cause any problems with image formation. Those three components are quite clean and they can be assembled together. I'll do that next. So, get this in position. Right, lift the blade actuating ring in position, get it wriggle it under that spring. This should be facing the... Why is that facing in that direction? That's not right. That's better. Should be sitting there like that, and the spring needs to be lifted across behind that post. That spring's job is to detent. It holds the blade actuating ring in either the fully open position or the fully closed position. It biases it towards either end really. It's to stop, probably stop shutter blade bounce, so that when the shutter blades close at the end of the exposure, they don't bounce off the stop and open again slightly. Now there are three small screws that go around here. I'm getting one of them in place, one of the short screws. Oh, the screwdriver's magnetised, that's always fun. And here, where that post is, that holds this bracket. The bracket holds the tail of the main drive spring for the shutter. And this one requires the longer of the three screws, because it has to account for the thickness of that bracket. And the third screw, same as the first screw, one of the two shorter screws goes in here. Just do those up lightly and check that my blade actuating ring moves freely. It does. Check that these screws are not poking through the mechanism plate, which is what can happen if you get them in the wrong positions. And then I'll nip those three screws up tight. And that is the mechanism plate, the main part of the mechanism plate back together. I'm going to lubricate this with some graphite powder before I put the shutter blades back in place and close the shutter up. But the next thing I need to do is clean these shutter blades, which are quite marked. I can't tell immediately whether there's any corrosion on there. There's certainly some oil staining here. Might be graphite powder visible there. This one here is quite mottled in its appearance, and that might be graphite powder, maybe corrosion. I won't know until I clean these really and see what sort of a result I get. So again, it will be naphtha on a cotton bud. Start with this blade, and I'm just holding the blade down gently with the wooden toothpick while I work on it. And I just flip from one face to the other, look at the blade, and I've got quite bright light coming in from my right over here, so I can see from the reflections how well I'm doing at cleaning those surfaces. That blade came out well. I'll pop that in the corner of the picture here. To the second blade. This blade showed considerable staining, particularly up at the end here where it runs around the post. So I'm interested to see if it cleans up well. Again, I'm looking at the blade in the light from the window, and it allows me to judge how clean I've got it, because any imperfections tend to show up because of the angle of the light. The biggest problem with shutter blades of this type typically is oil. If oil gets onto the blades, because they are very thin and highly polished, they will stick together. It will act like a glue. The blades will not want to be separated, and so the shutter will not open. And if you do manage to get it to open, it might not want to close. Now this blade, there seems to be a residual mark here in this corner. Looking at that in the light, I can see that that's probably corrosion. That one I think I will have to polish with Brasso. I'll pop that to one side. Let's have a look at blade number 5. Polishing shutter blades is less fraught than polishing diaphragm blades because they're nice and flat. There's not so much to get caught on, and you're less likely to buckle them up by catching your cleaning cloth or cotton bud on them while you're polishing them. But it does happen. If it does happen, of course, then you're very likely to have to go and find another replacement shutter blade, because if you get a kink in them, you can't get them out. You can never get them dead flat again. Right, well, I'll just clean this with a bit of Brasso and then I'll be back.